if you can just realize that however much you think what you say is important and interesting and relevant, and however great you think you are, which may be true, you've always got to be aware of how our brains work. And unless it is meaningful and emotional and wrapped in a story, there is a good chance, and a bigger chance than probably you think, of what you say going into people's attention span. So if you can use a story as a way of avoiding that, I think that's not a bad place to start.
This is Personal Brand Blueprint with me, your host, Dave Polikoff, where I sit down with proven experts who've built successful personal brands to break down how they did it, so you know the exact blueprint on how to build a personal brand that attracts attention, builds trust, and converts your dream clients online. We get super specific. I'm talking real-time feedback on what social channels to be on, what marketing strategies to implement, and what content is capturing and converting the most attention on social. How do we do this? Because Personal Brand Blueprint is powered by ZenPost, your content partner for research-driven strategy and done-for-you video that helps you be seen, be trusted, and win more business. Whether you need more guidance on how to create client-attracting content yourself, or you need a professional creative team to create and publish your content for you, ZenPost is your strategic content partner. If you're ready to increase your visibility, followers, and leads through video content, then head over to zenpost.com today to learn more. Now, let's get into the show. Storytelling is critical when it comes to personal branding. How do we stand out amongst all of the other coaches, consultants, speakers, authors that exist in our feeds? We need to connect with our audience in some way outside of the regular top 10 lists that everyone's publishing, and storytelling is a critical way to do that. But how do we tell stories that actually captivate our audiences, draw them in, and get them to trust us enough to want to engage with us and potentially, ideally, become a client or customer? So that is why today I have on Anthony Tasgal, or as we call him, Taz. He is a trainer, multi-time author and speaker, and the owner of POV Marketing and Research Ltd. His recent book, The Classical Marketing Book, features ways that the marketing lessons from the Greeks and Romans, which I'm excited to get into, and how we can apply that to our personal brand. So Taz, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
So I want to start with, you're a multi-time author, and you've hit on a lot of important subjects that we'll touch on today. But kind of take us through that journey of all of those books. What books have you written, and kind of talk us through the journey and experiences that you've gone through that have been like the catalyst for why you wrote these books?
I suppose you're asking me to tell my story, really.
Yeah, if you will.
I suppose I should do that. So I spent a lot of my youth and late teens in university time studying Latin, Greek, and ancient history. And anyone who knew me at the time would have thought I'd be an academic studying Homer and Virgil and living in an ivory tower somewhere in Oxford. And then, as these things do, Act 2, I met a girl. And she was doing a very modern subject, sociology. And then we became sort of partners, moved in together, and she said, let's try get a job. So I said, well, all right. And I ended up working in the advertising industry. So anyone who knew me at the time thought, sorry, you've gone from studying the history of the Peloponnesian War and Alexander the Great to selling ads. And it was a bit of a leap, I have to say. But I spent a fair amount of time in the ad industry as what's called an account planner, a strategist. And during my years in that business, I found two things. One is the amount of presentations that I had to endure, most of which were just unbearably dull. And also some of the brands that I work with who were trying to create, as you said in your introduction, differentiation or saliency to stand out from their competitors. Again, were mostly quite bland and anemic. And I thought, well, I've come from a sort of storytelling world. Can't I bring some of that into both how we do presentations and also how we make brands more salient? And that sort of became my mission, really. So I left the ad industry full time, but started writing, training, presenting on that sort of interface between how do we look at the past, how do we look at great storytellers, people who knew about persuasion, and how can we bring that into our modern marketing and communications methods to make them more powerful and more effective. So that's sort of how I got there. And I've written, this is the seventh book, the storytelling book. And over that time, I've talked about three topics, mainly storytelling, but also behavioral economics. For any of your listeners, it's nudge theory, Daniel Kahneman, why our brain is much more emotional than we like to think. And also a topic called insight, which I've also been fascinated by. So that's a sort of potted history of the last few centuries, Dave, of my work.
Yeah. And, storytelling being a through line through all of that, what was like the moment that you realized like how powerful storytelling is? I mean, you mentioned you had to sit through and I guess bear through a lot of terrible
Yeah.
presentations and advertising. What was the moment that you realized storytelling was kind of the critical element to positive marketing and advertising?
Well, I think it had always been sort of under the surface, because as well as studying all the old stuff, I was a great fan of comedy, still am, and looking at great comedians and how they hold a stage. And also, I'm a big sort of fan of how politicians and statesmen do it. So again, if you think about people in the past, again, it can be Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, some British ones as well. You realize a lot of these people do it naturally, and that a lot of it is through using the techniques of storytelling. So I was comparing that with what I was having to sit through in what I thought was a really creative industry, and a lot of it was, creative people, who were the creative people, were allowed to do that. But everyone else seemed to almost take pride in how mind-numbingly anemic they can make their presentations and documents. So it wasn't one particular like eureka moment, but I realised quite quickly that maybe there was something I could just bring to the party that would change things up a bit.
Why is it that we as humans love stories, but yet we suck at telling them so much?
Well, it's funny because one of the things I often do when I'm talking or training, I'll talk about restoring storytelling or restoring storytelling. Because as human beings, it's our natural software. We are born storytellers. As children, we listen to our family or our friends or our faith telling us stories about who we are, where we come from, the way the world is created. We understand, I often say we understand and we compartmentalize the world through stories. Not, I'm afraid, to disappoint some people, through spreadsheets. So in a sense, all I'm doing is to say it's almost like a childlike thing. We do it up to a certain age, and then, especially in business, I'm afraid, we're sort of told that we should stop doing it, that we have to start using jargon and cliches and acronyms and speak like management consultants and pretend that we're talking in facts and in numbers. And a word that I use a lot, Dave, is arithmocracy. It's a word I've sort of coined. So from the Greek word arithmos, which means numbers. So I say that we've, over the last, 30, 40 years, we've created this system which worships numbers, especially in business and especially in marketing, but also in education and policing and all sorts of things. So everything has to be led by metrics. And my point is, I get that, but what about the other end of that spectrum, where we go back to what human beings do best, which is understand how to communicate through stories? And linking what I said earlier about behavioral economics, one of the lessons of that particular sort of discipline is human beings are far more influenced by our emotions than we like to admit. So we like to think we're all completely rational and logical and independent, but spoiler alert, we're not. So I always say storytelling is a great way of identifying and amplifying emotions. So in a sense, all I'm saying is I'm not teaching anything that's really new. I'm just bringing it back to people who've perhaps had it shaken out of them in the business world. So that's how I like to sort of position it, really.
For us personal brands who want to inject storytelling into our content, maybe even into our sales process, because you do mention we make decisions largely on emotion. And so what are some of the key ways, maybe using the Greeks and Romans as maybe an example, that we can incorporate storytelling into our marketing and sales process to make some easier decisions for our leads?
Yeah, one of the things I talk a lot about, and again, it goes back to the first book, the storytelling book, which is now 10 years old. So it's written in gold, and there's a needle and thread on the front, and it goes back to a story called, a story about Theseus and the Minotaur. Just in case any of your listeners don't know this, it's King Minos of Crete had defeated the Athenians in battle, and he said, "Send me young men, 7 young men, 7 young women on a ship, and there they will be taken to the centre of the labyrinth, a fiendish maze. And in the centre of the maze is the Minotaur, half man, half bull. And he basically destroys, he tears the Athenians limb from limb. And then one day in Athens, a king, Theseus, announces that he will go to Crete, and he will find his way into the centre of the labyrinth, and he will kill the Minotaur, free the Athenians. So he goes to Crete, he meets King Minos, but he also meets Minos' daughter Ariadne. And it's a famous story. She gives him a ball of thread, and she says, no one, because they sort of fall in love as these things happen. She says, no one has ever found their way into the centre. It's such a complicated maze. So take this ball of thread and unravel it all the way in so that you get into the centre, so that when you've killed the Minotaur, you can trace your way back out. And I've always loved that as a story and a metaphor. And the first thing I say when I'm working with people in their presentations, developing their personal brand, whatever it is, you need to have a thread. Because otherwise, what you end up doing is having fact after fact, bullet point after bullet point, sales point after sales point, number after number. And again, if you haven't got it by now, I don't think that's a great way, because your brain will switch off. So I often say that numbers numb us, but stories stir us. So I spend a lot of my time working, whether it's with clients on their brands, developing their personal brand, their communications, their presentations, on finding a thread that has a beginning, a middle, and end, but holds everything together. Because again, going back to sort of English terms and etymology, we talk about losing the thread, and that's why, because that's, as I often like to say, we're trying to work with the brain, not against it. So that's always my first and most important point. The second one is, it's important how you start. So whether it's the first time you meet somebody, it's the homepage of your website, it's the first line of your resume, whatever, that really matters. And again, when I look at people, especially if they're trying to introduce themselves, or they're talking about themselves, or it's their sort of personal brand mission statement, that really matters, because the brain is disproportionately influenced by what comes first. And the third point, I'll have to end with that, is because it's the magic number 3. So I always say, whatever you're doing, 3, you're never going to achieve more than 3 things. So don't bother. So try and make what you've got definable and separable into a maximum of 3 things. So if anyone's listening, watching this, and remembers those 3 items, I should be quite happy.
Yeah. I always find that, from very like logical, analytical people, they and we approach communication with that kind of like fact-based narrative of like, this is what you get, these are the items, these are, we're going to go through step 1, step 2, step 3. And when we talk about marketing and sales and emotion, people aren't buying based on that logic. It's like the Steve Jobs, it's not bits and bytes, it's 1,000 songs in your pocket. They're buying from that like
Yeah.
desire or emotional need and such. And so I find that if I speak in bits and bytes, it's like I'm pushing information to the person, and I'm giving them homework to connect the dots, versus in like storytelling, if I'm drawing them in, they're connecting the dots through the kind of the narrative that I'm saying by drawing them in. How can we draw in and spark emotion from our audience and our leads through story narrative? Is there like certain types of storytelling arcs or strategies that we can use to apply instead, in replace of the bits and bytes?
Yeah, and again, I can give you, a 10, 20 just now, but And also, I think a lot of it is when I work with clients, it's very much on a one-to-one. So actually, it's about you telling your story. So I'm not going to try and impose necessarily something on it. But what I will say is it has to have empathy. So I talk an awful lot about empathy because that's what stories are. Stories are empathy engines. So when you're watching the latest Marvel movie or you're watching something on Netflix or you're reading a book, a good story will make you care. And I emphasize this a lot because I think that's the trouble with bits and bytes. And Jobs knew that, as you say, absolutely perfectly. All good creators, innovators, communicators know that. You want your audience to care. And again, you want them to care not just about what you are saying, but actually about who you are. So a lot of the storytelling has to make someone feel connected to you. So one of the things I tend to do sort of quite often when I'm speaking at conferences or training, I will get people to sort of understand a bit about who I am, my backstory. So part of me talking about classics and part of me talking about where I came from is people can understand how I've got to where I've got to. If you just come in with bare facts and messages, you cut off that empathy right at the start. So again, one of the things that I'll emphasize with people is it might be your past, it might be something that's happened to you, it might be something you woke up one day and you thought, what's wrong with, this particular product or service. But try and bring it back to something that people care about. Because if you get them to care first, you've engaged their storytelling brain, and then you can put in all your facts and bits and bytes. If all you have is bits and bytes, it's really hard to get people to care. So that word caring, if people remember nothing else from this, but they remember caring, I should be quite happy.
Yeah, I like that keyword empathy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think people just want to feel as though you understand them, and that's yeah, speaking on the emotional level, not the the logical level. So to kind of talk me through the marketing lessons of the Greeks and Romans, it seems like this is a good blending of your story and your history. What is like one of the key lessons? I'm sure there's many in the book that we'll all go and read, but what's maybe like a key one or two that I think could relate best to personal brands?
Yeah, one of the things, so there are three sections, obviously three again, in the book, which I've helpfully labeled MVP. So depending on where you come from, it's either minimum viable product or most valuable player. So you can, but in my world, it's mythology, vocabulary, and persuasion. Those are the three areas that I've sort of chunked the book into. So persuasion is perhaps the obvious one because that's where storytelling comes in. So there's a famous Roman writer, politician, lawyer called Cicero. Some people might have heard of Marcus Tullius Cicero. And the thing that I found probably most relevant to people, especially when they're creating their personal brands and communicating it, is, as we've already been talking about, Dave, how do you persuade people? And Cicero had three words in Latin, right? So docere, to inform, delectare, to delight, and movere, to move. And given that was, first century BCE, so 2,000 years ago, a bit, it's not a bad definition, really. I don't think much has changed. Media's changed. I think Cicero would have been quite shocked by TikTok. But the need to persuade people hasn't, and the means of persuasion hasn't. And the point he would say, and before him Aristotle would have said the same in Greece, we're very good at docere, we're very good at informing people. And that's changed, obviously. We've got big data, we've got more, information that you can shake a stick at. But they were all keen to emphasise that's not enough. You need to delight people, which again is just make them feel something. And movere, to move. And again, most Latin languages, or Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, the word motion and emotion, they're the same word. So again, it goes back to what we were just talking about a minute ago, this need to sort of move people and not just sitting on sort of bare facts. And I mentioned Aristotle. Aristotle had three words, ethos, logos, and pathos, which incidentally are not the Three Musketeers. So logos is facts and information. Again, we've talked about that. Pathos is the Greek word for feelings. So again, empathy, sympathy. But the word that he uses, which again we don't tend to perhaps think about as much, ethos, means like authority or credibility. Now again, with personal brands, that's incredibly important. And people often say to me, well, are you born with that or can you learn it? Now some people are born with it. And again, I think for me, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama just had that ability to sort of sound like they know what they're talking about. But you can teach it. You can teach that sense of authority. And again, a bit of etymology, word origins. In Latin, author and authority. It's the same word. As human beings, we're designed to give authors, storytellers, authority. So again, for me, all of those are things in terms of the persuasion side of it that I think we can still use and apply in, what we're doing today. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, the idea of author and authority. It almost is like those who just kind of step up and voice something, you automatically just kind of associate as having something important to say, just for the fact of that they are stepping up and saying it. I think that maybe is the difficult part a little bit with the common social feed now and personal branding, is everyone has a voice and everyone has a platform for it. So it sounds like a bit of the storytelling and emotional side of things is kind of the differentiator, because if everyone if everyone is voicing their opinion their opinions, we're giving authority to everyone. But then I think over time people have quickly realized that not everyone's voice is equal, and sometimes people, especially with ChatGPT these days, are kind of just parrots for other gurus or parrots for whatever ChatGPT says. So that kind of storytelling element and mastering that, not just telling your story, but just telling stories well, it feels like it's the big differentiator. Is that kind of how you see it as well? And it's not just being an author, but being an author in a way that, you know, drives that emotional element to it.
yeah, as I said before, my background, my commercial background was, working with brands and trying to devise sort of communication strategies. And it became very clear, even when I started, and even more so now, that many, many brands operate in markets which are largely homogeneous. They're largely identical. So whether it's cars or tech or films or whatever, an awful lot of the time, there are not many significant rational differentiators. And the same is, for personal brands. Again, I own 3 children, grown-up children. And I was saying to them when they're applying for jobs, what is it that I or another employer would look at you and see that is different from all the other people who, as my daughter does, work in market research? It's got to be about other things. There are things that you can do that they can all do. You're good at research, you're good at understanding clients, you understand how research works, you can present, you can develop insights. What is it that you can do that no one else can do? Or how is it you do what you do that is different? So whether it's brands, and again, good brands like Nike and Apple and Virgin, they know that. They know it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. And again, I think that, for me, in terms of stories and characters, and also your own personal brand, again, there's a real overlap there. Because a lot of communication, use the word content, right? I'm going to be honest, I'm going to be rude about the word content. Sorry to anyone who's listening, watching. I always say to people who work in content, just swap the word content for the word stuff. Because content is just stuff, but with a better PR agency. So just because you call it content doesn't make it inherently interesting. And again, if you can use story and you can use tone of voice and character and personality, then you're more likely to create any brand, but especially a personal brand that is going to stand out. So I think, again, that ties some of the things together that we've been talking about.
Yeah. And on that note, so obviously you have many books, you're a speaker, given a TED Talk, obviously podcasting and such. What's kind of been, out of the efforts, marketing channels, strategies, that you've had for your personal brand, has there been one channel that you think has kind of drawn the most attention to your personal brand?
Yeah, I'm gonna do that politician thing, Dave, of answering a different question. Um, I've written a book about insight because, as I said, I'm obsessed with what insight is and the fact that market researchers seem to think that insight is just data, which it isn't. So I'm a big fan of serendipity, things happening by accident. Because I think if you look at, again, at great brands, great innovations, inventions, great movies, a lot of them happen when different things connect. And I found this has happened to me quite a bit. So I've tried to sort of plan things in my life, but often things have happened almost by accident. So at one point I had a website and I was investing in it, and then wasn't really working for me. And I've now found that LinkedIn, I actually can sort of almost, not quite, just let LinkedIn do a lot of my work for me. And again, because I'm doing podcasts, I've got books, I'm doing talks. There's an awful lot of stuff that is being generated around that. So again, one of the things I'll say to people about the personal brand is, and I think you hinted at it before, some of it is push, but a lot of it is pull. And if you can create that stuff to be out there, and again, one of the reasons I write the books, apart from I just like writing, is that it's just a way of getting me out there, getting people to sort of read the books, watch podcasts about the books, send me messages. So I would say to people, it is a balance between what you create and what channels you want to sort of use. But also, how can you create stuff which will actually have a sort of longer life, which you might not be able to control, but it will actually bring in things in a week or a month or a year. And I've been able to sort of have that, I think, discipline to say, especially with LinkedIn, occasionally with Twitter and X, and also just doing these sort of podcasts. I find that's a good way of just keeping what I'm saying hopefully out there, and then people writing to me and saying, well, that was interesting, would you like to do some work?
Hmm.
So that's my sort of, I don't want to call it philosophy exactly, Dave, but it's something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think obviously between like the TEDx talk and books and podcasts, it's like you're kind of creating these like staples or these putting these flags in the ground that are where people can come gather, as I like to say, kind of watering holes. And then when they vibe with your message, go, oh, let me check this person out, or for other talks and such like that. So yeah, I think that's the when we I'll use the word content, but when we talk about short form content, sometimes it feels like it's a little bit ephemeral, in the sense that like maybe it has its day for a week or two versus a TED talk that can live on for
Yeah.
years.
Well, one of the things, again, it's a story, so if we've got time, I'll tell it.
Absolutely.
I mentioned my first book, storytelling book, is 10 years old now. And when I first put it to a couple of publishers, who I won't name because it will embarrass them, they said to me, well, why do business people need a book about storytelling? It's all about social media. It's all about digital transformation. And I said, well, it's been around a bit, storytelling. And they were trying to tell me it wasn't really like topical or relevant. So now, after it's been out for 10 years, and in various languages, it's now sold 40,000 copies. So, I think it's quite timeless. But the other thing, just the thing I pick up that you said about short form, one of the things, again, and it goes back to your previous question, Dave, about sort of getting stuff out there. I'm always aware of trying to create sort of small expressions that people can remember. So I have a few, and I don't know how much time we'll have for all of them, but I'll give you one of them. And it goes back to what I said about creating saliency, how you create standout for your personal brand or anything. And it's an example of what I talked about with insight, with serendipity, because it happened to me by accident. So I was writing a speech for a client, and I was talking about the brain. I was talking about attention span and how it's limited and all that stuff. Anyone who's looking at their laptop now, you'll see the letters N and M are next to each other. So I actually typed out attention spam with an M. And I thought, oh, I quite like that. So I've adopted it, and it's become like one of my little sort of sound bites. And it's a shorthand for my sort of belief that whatever you do, right? Whatever you say about your personal brand, your story, what you can offer, unless you can avoid going into your audience's attention spam, it's a waste of time. Because we like to think, don't we, everything we say goes from our attention inbox into our audience's attention inbox. Or, your girlfriend or your wife or your children, the same thing. But because of the way our brains work, no one knows, maybe 80-90% will go into attention spam. So I use that little nugget as an expression to say to people, that's where you start in terms of creating a story or in terms of winning over an audience or gaining leads. If you don't avoid getting put in attention spam, it's lost. You might as well not bother. So I'm a great believer in having these little expressions and words, which again people can take and remember. So that's just one example, and I've got a few more as well.
Well, no, I like that because I mean that maybe doesn't fit into. I mean, maybe that could be put into a book or a TED talk or whatnot. But the other kind of value of short form is that you can take bits and bytes of longer form content and then just hyper focus on that as one little 45 to 90-second clip or post to really hit home that point instead of reading the entire book or whatever. So little
Yeah.
snackable content. And so I love that concept. Well, Taz, this has been awesome. What I like to do, we've given so much great kind of key educational moments, but I also like to kind of just end the episode with just, if there's one thing that you want our audience to take home from today's episode, what's like the one lesson that you want to make sure that they remember?
I think I should say three, really, shouldn't I? I think the power of three is not a bad one. I think the attention spam, I think really, if you can just realize that however much you think what you say is important and interesting and relevant, and however great you think you are, which may be true, you've always got to be aware of how our brains work. And unless it is meaningful and emotional and wrapped in a story, there is a good chance, and a bigger chance than probably you think, of what you say going into people's attention spam. So if you can use a story as a way of avoiding that, I think that's not a bad place to start.
Love it. Taz, this was awesome. If people want to learn more about you or what you got going on or check out your books, where do you want to send them?
I'm Tasgal, Tastasgal at LinkedIn. That's probably, given what I've said about LinkedIn, I'm not sponsored by the way. That's probably a good as place as any. I'm at Taswell Hill at Twitter or X as well. But you can find the books on Amazon and various places as well.
Great. Taz, thanks so much for being on today's episode.
It's been great. Thank you, Dave.
See you on the next episode of Personal Brand Blueprint.